The advent of the COVID-19 has meant postponing of over 60 elections worldwide, including in countries hoping to hold transformative elections, such as Ethiopia. From a critical perspective, many analysts have suggested that the postponing and modification of election conditions and the electoral process reflects a deeper and troubling pattern of democratic erosion in some countries and authoritarian consolidation in others. Before the spread of COVID-19, there was a sustained and problematic democratic deficits in a number of countries, including Benin and Zambia, as well as a limiting of political rights in countries such as Tanzania. Many of you shared your concerns about pre-COVID-19 conditions in a number of countries, as well as the associated election quality, and were particularly concerned about post-conflict countries such as Somalia, because of already pre-COVID-19 difficulties holding widely legitimate elections. At the same time, election practitioners and specialists have sought to offer advice to important stakeholders, including election management bodies, on how to hold elections safely. This live conversation focuses on steps that are necessary to hold elections, standards that must be applied to safeguard democratic elections, the support that is required from both international and regional stakeholders, and the approach needed to monitor the quality of elections. Welcome to Leaders of Africa Live, a conversation about navigating elections without postponing democracy in the COVID-19 era. Leaders of Africa Live is interactive. Share your voice in joining the conversation in the chat and on Zoom meeting as well, found at leadersofafrica.org/live, or tweet using the hashtag #LeadersAfricaLive. Welcome to you all. Let us know where you're joining us from. Select comments and call-ins will be shared in today's live conversation. We may all be in separate locations today, but we are all together today. Welcome to everyone here. So before we get going, I want to set the stage a little bit for our guests before I introduce our panelists. Today we are looking at elections in Africa, but the impacts are clearly global. We can see in recent infographic from International IDEA, we can see that it has affected a number of elections across the globe. We are also going to be discussing those effects in a variety of different ways, particularly the effects across a number of different areas, from the pre-election phase to the post-election phase and the election day as well. And so we're going to be having a broadly wide conversation across these areas today, and our panelists are very well equipped to handle this conversation. So let me introduce our panelists today and welcoming them from all different locations. And so let me introduce our panelists. We are joined by first Rushdie Nakardian, who is presently the Africa Regional Director of the Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, in Washington, D.C. Rushdie has over 20 years of experience working to improve elections, ranging from working directly with election management bodies to supporting election observation, as well as supporting efforts at voter education. Rushdie joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to you, Rushdie.
Good morning, Peter, from Washington, D.C. Good morning to all the viewers.
It's good to have you here. Wonderful. And we are also joined by Olafunto Akindero of International IDEA. Olafunto is a Senior Program Officer for the IDEA's Africa and West Asia Regional Program. She was formerly the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy, serving as the head of elections and political process. Olafunto joins us today, and we are so happy to have you here. Welcome, Olafunto.
Hello, Peter. Hello, viewers. Hello from Johannesburg.
Wonderful. Welcome. And finally, we are joined by Grant Masterson of the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa. Grant is the Senior Program Manager for the Governance, Institutions, and Political Processes Department at ISA. He has published on a range of topics, including the African Peer Review Mechanism. Grant joins us from Johannesburg, South Africa. Welcome to you, Grant.
Hi, Peter. Hi to my fellow panelists, and hello everyone else who's watching.
And we're hoping the stream quality is good. At the beginning here, I was a little bit distracted because we were having some comments on the quality of the stream, but hopefully everyone is hearing and seeing us fine. We look forward to our contributions. Before we begin, I just want to point out our panelists have together over 50 years of experience supporting elections, both directly and indirectly. And I was actually trying to add up the number of electoral processes that you've been involved in. But I think that number is much lower because than it would otherwise be, because there are some elections you've been directly involved with, and then obviously the elections you've contributed to in indirect ways as well. So that number is very, very high. So a wealth of experience here today. So I want to start with you, Rushdie. You have written about this connection between election concerns and this issue of democratic erosion. And actually, before the conversation, some in our audience, and sharing their questions before today, talked about some of the pre-COVID-19 concerns that were present and how they may be exacerbated and fit into this concern about democratic erosion that is present. And I'm curious your thoughts about the effects of adjusting electoral timelines and modifications, and whether, in your view, this fits into a broader concern with the quality of democracy on the continent.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for the question. Indeed, I mean, democracies thrive on assembly, transparency, and confidence. And as we can see, and as we know from the African continent, many of those things are under pressure generally under normal circumstances. And COVID-19 and the pandemic adds to that. I mean, we see the pandemic is not slowing down. Between May 5th and June 9th, it has doubled twice, so increased more than 4 times. And what we are seeing is that there are certain very real pressures when it comes to the existing circumstances. Every single country out of the 18 countries having elections this year have their own story to tell, whether it's stories of insecurity, lack of engagement with the opposition, whether it's uncertainty about the electoral laws, or in some cases just a lack of information generally. And add COVID-19 onto that, and you start seeing all kinds of other dynamics emerging. Firstly, often in these kinds of circumstances, I mean, we don't go through a pandemic regularly. So the law is often silent on issues of electoral emergencies, which is what this is. And it raises all kinds of questions about the issue related to terms of office. And when those stakes are increased, the level of polarization increases. We see states of emergencies, lockdowns, quarantines, all kinds of provisions like that put in place, which means that election management bodies can't do business as usual. So that compresses their time, their electoral calendars, and with that also then the quality and transparency that comes with that. The ability to procure goods, adapting to training, which no longer can be in a face-to-face kind of a manner, ability to actually engage with citizens and with parties to increase transparency. You're looking at increased budgets when budgets are meant to be spent on the health crisis. And so there are competing priorities. You're also seeing great risk when it comes to voter turnout. And the reduced voter turnout will impact on both the legitimacy and issues of inclusion. And ultimately, I think, as you've written as well about in the past, I mean, trust in elections often relates not just to the process, but the electoral institution itself. And if the electoral institution is under pressure, which it might be under normal circumstances, layer the COVID crisis on top of that, and you're seeing a real threat to democracy in general. And by the same token, Africans want more democracy. African citizens want more democracy. And so that sort of just raises the stakes for everybody in terms of what needs to happen in order to actually deliver within an electoral mandate, on time, deliver an electoral service to all citizens.
So just building on what Rushdie has mentioned, Olafunto, I'm curious in looking at some of these competing priorities that are present, Are there any particular countries in your mind that are perhaps more concerning than others, or are probably more vulnerable to some of these competing priorities and the possibilities for electoral manipulation, in your view?
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Rushdie, for setting the pace for this. As Rushdie mentioned, most African countries are already faced with multiple challenges. So issues ranging from security to other forms of challenges. But very quickly, countries that come to mind, I know, for instance, in Liberia, there's already conversations about the Electoral Commission saying we may not be able to go ahead with the elections because we are not able to meet up with the requirements we have for procurement. Countries like Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire have missed out on some steps and delayed their voter registration to an extent. Then when you come to post-conflict countries like Somalia, the question will be whether these elections would even hold at all. Chad, as I'm told this morning, already made a decision to say that given the pandemic and included then the security concerns, the elections will be postponed. So there are quite a number of countries that come to mind. But it doesn't mean that all the countries I've listed will postpone their elections. I'm just saying that some of them have already raised concerns as they have missed some of the key steps in their preparations.
And Olomido, from our audience before the conversation, wrote in about this question of post-conflict countries and conflict countries, such as Somalia, for example. That seemed to be one country that people are concerned about. Olafunta, any sort of insights there? You've mentioned this issue also of post-conflict countries, or countries that are trying to get back on track when it comes to regular electoral processes. What does it look like in countries like Somalia that many of the audience are curious about?
Somalia is the one everybody has an eye on because it's post-conflict and it would be the first election in so many years. But you also have countries like Chad, I think Central Africa as well. The point is that in post-conflict countries, the pandemic certainly is affecting everybody. But one thing to realize is in vulnerable populations, the effect is worse. And in situations where you have existing inequalities as well, these get exacerbated by the pandemic. So in post-conflict countries, it's a more delicate space. You were talking of Somalia specifically. It is interesting because in Somalia's case, not only have they missed the steps for registration, even the legal framework has not yet been agreed on. The parliament was supposed to have sat, I think, sometime in April, and because the parliament was closed, I think the next sitting to consider issues around the electoral law will be around the 27th of June, from what I gather. So already you can see how in their own case, the impact of the pandemic is worse compared to other countries where the law is set, you just have to work with it. In Somalia, they're starting from the scratch. So the effect of the pandemic is worse. And of course, issues around the restrictions of movement. I remember the chair of the commission saying they cannot even do the security assessments required for them to decide on where will polling stations be located. So the most basic aspects of an election are more affected in post-conflict countries because a lot of things are still being put in place compared to other countries.
Now moving on to you, Grant, I'm curious about this issues of costs that we've been talking about, of competing interests, the health interests at the one hand, and the interest in holding regular elections and also ensuring the quality of those elections. And I'm curious, in your view, what are some of the governance challenges that you've seen that are directly related to elections or are in the broader view of conditions for elections that you see are the most concerning in your view?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so at this stage, there seem to be three broad approaches to dealing with the COVID-19 challenge in elections. The first one being to just treat them as business as usual. And we saw that in Burundi, that essentially campaign continued with very, very few restrictions on it, that the election went ahead. The president wanted the elections to go ahead, and so they went ahead. Many people were quite critical of that particular decision because they felt that it unnecessarily placed into danger a large number of people who were involved in the election who could have been better protected perhaps by a more cautious approach. That's, of course, the first approach. Then the second approach would be something along the lines of, let's split the difference, let's be quite cautious, let's postpone committing to when this election takes place. Let's flag that there may be disruptions. We may push the election date back, but we're not committing one way or another. And then, of course, there are countries like Ethiopia that have taken the decision to postpone the elections indefinitely until they can conduct some sort of needs assessment and evaluate the conditions on the ground for whether the elections are suitable. This is the necessary adjustments that need to be made require cooperation between the electorate and the political leadership of the country. And that political leadership includes both the ruling party and opposition parties and other contestants in the election. And one of the really difficult things that Olafunto was referencing a moment ago in post-conflict countries is that there's going to be a necessary cooperation between ruling and opposition parties, ruling and opposition candidates, to find some kind of consensus in these situations that Rushdie pointed out have no legal parameters described. That's going to need for parties to reach across the divide and find one another, and this is going to be the best way forward for us. In particular, in those post-conflict countries where there is so little trust, that hence the conflict that the country is emerging out of, finding that consensus is made even more complicated.
Absolutely. And let's talk about some of these logistical challenges. And I want to talk about the issues of opposition and accepting elections in just a bit, which I think is a really important piece of the post-election side. But I want to talk a little bit about the logistical elements that were raised, again, coming back to this issue of the competing priorities between health and the quality of elections. And just 2 days ago, the Center for Democracy, CDD West Africa, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies hosted an event. And on the event was the chair of INEC, that is the Independent Electoral Commission of Nigeria. And I think it was really interesting in that event that the chairman was talking about some of the steps that were being taken to ensure people's health at the polling station, the logistical steps, right? Things of such as wearing a mask and encouraging voters to wear masks as well as polling officials. This other issue of temperature checks of at some level, although it was a little bit unclear of how that would be managed. So I'm curious, and I want each of you to kind of respond to this logistical question here. What do you see as the ideal in terms of ensuring that voters are healthy and that they feel that they can participate in a healthy way in electoral process? What do you think is ideal? And also reflecting on what may be possible in many contexts, given some of the logistical challenges that are already present in holding elections in a pre-COVID-19 era. Starting with you, Rushdie.
Thanks, Peter. Indeed, a complex question. I think the one thing is that what we see commonly across many of the elections that have already been held, whether they've been Mali, Burundi, Guinea, and Benin. Sorry for the pause, I just had to make sure. You saw social distancing being applied, but not uniformly across the board. Definitely, everybody aspired to have face masks, at least at minimum for the staff. But again, those are instances where ordinary citizens might not have access to that. And then you also saw definitely hand washing kits has been very commonly referenced across the board. you're trying to do three things here. One, you're trying to reduce people's exposure, so potentially reducing the numbers of people that are in a polling station at a particular point in time. In places like Nigeria, polling usually takes place outside, and I think the risk is reduced there. There are other risks that normally come in. I mean, Nigeria has many instances of ballot box snatching and all kinds of things associated like that. You then also seeing a need to reduce exposure to person-to-person transmission, and that's often where the masks come in. Some folks, especially officials, have gloves issued to them that can reduce that level of exposure. But then critically also there's exposure to surfaces, and one of the big challenges, inevitably, you can have people stand 1 to 2 meters apart, have a mask, and have minimal contact with election officials. But when you get inside, you're often one of the big symbols of elections, especially on the African continent, used to combat voter fraud is the use of indelible ink. And here you've got instances where people either put their finger into the indelible ink pot or have a little swatch that is used to make a mark on the finger. And that was probably one of those points where the risk is significantly increased. And you have situations also where it's unclear whether the ink will prevent, while it has biocides and a pretty high silver nitrate and alcohol content in the ink itself, it's not been proven that it will prevent COVID-19. So there are those kinds of things attached to it, and that costs money. If one looks at what was done in South Korea, for example, it's held up as a bit of a poster child for how to run an election during COVID-19. They had touchless thermometers. The moment somebody showed that they had a temperature, they were asked to actually go to a separate voting booth outside where the officials who were there were in their hazmat suits with goggles and all of those kinds of things. But we know that they spent about $22 million just on that equipment, the personal protective gear. I mean, that works out to about 50 cents per 50 US cents per voter. And I'm not sure that many election commissions in Africa have that additional budget that they could be using. So it's buying the PPE that will protect voters when they go to the polling stations. It's taking care that there's enough sanitization that's happening and so forth. But sometimes, and we often see this with a number of election commissions that have had to pause their voter registration exercise, like Ghana, Burkina Faso, Niger started theirs and had to put it on hold in the capital. But they have instances where they now have to kind of buy PPE twice. When Ghana goes to do voter registration, possibly later in June, they're going to have to supply that masks and gloves and all of those kinds of things. And they're going to have to do it again at the end of the year when they go to elections. And folks start raising issues about, maybe this is the time that we go to technology and the use of electronic voting. And that's a whole kettle of fish entirely on its own. We are needing to look at the trust levels in elections at the moment, get that right before we lay electronic voting on top of that, where the acceptance of election results, and you mentioned it, is going to be a big question. And then we're not even talking about once the election is done, all of that equipment and things that have been used needs to be brought back and disposed of properly. All of these things, it makes the job of any election official much harder, but it also makes the role of all other stakeholders in this much more important to ensure that that quality investment is there and that the requirements of the law are being abided by and standards. And we can get into this whole question about how one is tracking standards during this time period as well. But these are critical issues not to be dismissed when it comes to the logistics and the cost of elections.
Absolutely. And I want to have a discussion about that technological solution, because oftentimes when it comes to electoral challenges, the first thing that we think of is the implementation of new technologies. And well, I want to talk about that e-voting component, because that was one of the questions we received before our conversation today. Olafunto, just building on what Rushdie has said and sort of some of the costs that are present, as well as the intricacies of ensuring that things such as using the indelible ink are safe for voters. From your perspective, would you agree with Rushdie that these are some of the major concerns? And if so, are there others that we should be sort of paying attention to, particularly on the health and safety end of the spectrum?
Thanks. And first, I'll say I agree with everything Rushdie has said. I think he's mentioned some of the critical issues. But just maybe to mention a few more steps I've heard electoral commissions mention that they're taking. So you've had more and more commissions saying, oh, things like checking, inspecting, displaying and inspecting the register will now be done online and using SMS services. But this is only to check your details. But voter registration remains in person. You still have to go and appear at a registration center to get that done. So that remains a critical question. How do we keep that particular process safe? We've also heard of electoral commissions talking about the fact that voters will be wearing masks. And how do we easily identify voters with their masks on? And when they remove it, how do we ensure that the staff who is involved, who are involved, are not also getting their own health compromised? And I think there was one country that talked about specifically just beyond identifying you from your eyes or whatever, you would also be expected to put your signature against what is already there in the voters register, and it will be compared. And then for countries that have the biometric voter identification process, they've talked about steps being taken to, sanitize the fingerprint scanner. But all these come at an extra cost, like Rushdie mentioned. Some electoral commissions have also talked about recruiting extra staff who will then do the job of making sure that everybody complies. Some commissions have gone as far as saying, well, we can't provide masks to everyone, but in the rural areas where we feel that people are more vulnerable and they're more disadvantaged, we will provide masks in such areas as an incentive to encourage voters to come. One other thing I wanted to mention is that, yes, in the case of Guinea and Mali, they mentioned the fact that hand washing facilities were provided in the centers. But there was also news to say that that was not at every single center. So what happens in those particular centers where people are not able to? Electoral commissions, much as they are trying their best, it's also commendable to talk about INEC and I think a few other commissions that are already putting out guidelines and policies. I think Malawi as well issued an internal policy, and it was impressive to see that they actually had special provisions for their female staff. So staff who are pregnant are exempted from work at this time and stuff like that, which is good. But then electoral commissions are still left with the question of how do you handle campaigns? Mm-hmm. Because with the restrictions on movement and public gatherings, a good number of political parties are now coming out to say, if you restrict my right to campaign as equally as the ruling party, then I will go to court and challenge the outcome of these elections, because equal opportunity is one of the fundamental principles of fair elections. So electoral commissions are still left with that. How do we deal with the question of campaigning? What are the internal party nomination processes? In countries where you need to have party primaries, people will still have to gather. So you have so many steps where people have to gather, and electoral commissions in Africa are, still grappling with those questions. There's not a lot being said about adjustments to special voting arrangements that are in existence. And we're waiting to see whether there will be one or two electoral commissions that will touch on that. For instance, in Egypt, you already vote over 2 days. So would it be considered to say, okay, we extend the number of days for voting? South Africa already has special voting arrangement for the aged, for the invalid. Will there be modifications to those procedures so that such people don't have to come in contact with staff of the commission? And would you have more people? Would that process be open to more voters, or it will still be kept to those particular groups of voters? So these are some of the questions that are still outstanding.
And I just want to follow up quickly before I go to Grant, Olafunto, on something you said, and we've mentioned this before, that pre-election phase, and which we oftentimes think a lot about election day and election day logistics, but what has been raised thus far is the importance of the pre-election phase, and particularly the voter registration process, which also involves a widespread popular mobilization in terms of becoming registered. And I'm aware that a number of countries generally update their registry every time. Some of them update them, some of them do a whole new registry each election. And some countries like Ghana are now discussing that as well, holding a full new voter registry each time. And I'm curious what your advice is in this case. Does it make sense to kind of redo the voters roll, the incomplete voters roll, or do you see it more useful to perhaps update the voters roll to cut down on the number of people who have to register, for these upcoming elections? I'm curious your view on that.
Well, there's no standard to prescribe, but I think it's important to just take note that different countries are at different levels of development, and that might sometimes inform why you need to go through the process again. Good that you're talking to a Nigerian. Nigeria has gone the route of we will update the register. But in a situation where the register is continuously being updated in terms of new voters being added, but there is no efficient national civic registry where we register births and deaths so that the Electoral Commission can delist deceased voters. You now have a point, we've come to a point now in Nigeria where people are saying, oh, but voter turnout is getting so low. But it's a question of you have such a bloated register and you don't have a means of reviewing it. So that's why you find a lot of countries going the route of we register people for every time we need to have elections. But for countries like South Africa, Egypt, and a few other ones that have very strong national civic registries, it's easy to go the route of updating this register because there's a credible national registry of citizens and people trust it. Some countries have registries that are not trusted, and that's a completely, different story again, and that complicates the whole voters register situation. Mozambique last year was one example where there was national census, the figures were there, and then the Electoral Commission came up with completely different figures, and just a lot of confusion over the credibility of the register. So that's why you find more and more countries going that way. So if we all invest in creating credible census figures, creating national civic registries that are trustworthy, then you might have more countries being able to effectively review their register rather than conduct fresh registration all the time.
I think that's an important point to mention, that countries are at sort of different points when it comes to the necessary record keeping, the census data, the births and deaths data, and other things of this nature that is shaping some of these key decisions. Thanks, Olafunto, for clarifying it and explaining that. Grant, now to you. Looking again at the making elections safe issue, what do you see as some of the potential solutions to some of these concerns that have been raised? And do some of the solutions that we've been now brainstorming and proposing, perhaps, are they going to work across different contexts? And in which contexts do you think they're going to work very well, and which contexts are going to struggle with implementing some of these health and safety provisions?
Thank you, Peter. Well, so I think in trying to answer that question, I think I'd like to refer back to some of the lessons that we've drawn from the recent Ebola crisis in West Africa, because there are some very important lessons that we need to draw from that. It wasn't quite the same scale of the pandemic that is global in nature here. But of course, that epidemic was a very, very serious challenge for specific West African states. And one of the key lessons that has come out of that was the importance of local organizations, particularly local human rights organizations and other NGOs, in supporting the work of the medical teams who were trying to identify patients with the Ebola disease, who were trying to take the necessary medical precautions at that time. And perhaps I can segue that then into the challenge that we have facing these organizations right now, which is another cost of this COVID-19 pandemic. These organizations find their own ability to operate and in support of these elections severely constrained at the moment, both in terms of physical movement, in terms of their ability to operate in a normal environment and to do the kind of supportive work that they usually do. And also, of course, the financial constraints that these organizations are beginning to face now as well in being able to secure funding, to be able to secure ongoing support. And so these are organizations that are often taken for granted, but play such a critical role in the support of elections and in the support of managing these kind of health crises. And the real challenge here is that you can do all of these other things from a technical level. And these are all very good suggestions that are being discussed here. These are important suggestions that are being discussed. But ultimately, elections are a trust game, as we've been intimating all along, and that the importance of communities buying into and trusting in these processes. Do they trust that their electoral commission will be taking the necessary precautions to prevent them from getting the disease? Do they believe that the disease is worth taking the necessary precautions against? These are all issues. You saw in Sierra Leone and you saw in Liberia, communities would actively work against the health workers when there was no trust in the state, because they did not believe that these health workers were honest brokers. And so communities would hide the people that they suspected may have had the virus, in the process exacerbating the issue for the entire community. But they were doing it because they didn't trust that the state and the health workers were honest brokers. And it just has emphasized for me the way in which we underestimate and take for granted the importance of these human rights defenders who operate at the local level, and just how important their role has been. And now we're seeing, in this environment where it's as severely constrained, this is another real challenge that's perhaps not being taken quite as seriously right now, but I think we're going to understand its full effect as we go forward.
I think that issue of trust that has been raised is very important. We actually have a comment from the audience, and I'll read it out loud. And this is, I think this goes to this nexus between trust and the relationship to a broader set of stakeholders, in this case, the citizens as well. And the comment comes from Jalili Adebi, and it says, the conversation on how to conduct elections in the COVID era seems to exclude the public. Would this not affect voters' turnout in elections that would be able to be conducted in this period? And so to you, Rushdie, and this issue of the public, how are election stakeholders addressing not just civil society, we'll get to that as well, but the broader public? How are they communicating some of these expectations to the broader public? And is the broader public being sensitized and also consulted as to some of the steps that they need to feel comfortable participating?
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Jalili. We're sitting with a real conundrum here. One, we don't know enough about the COVID-19 and all of the dynamics attached to how it spreads and so forth. And then you're sitting with a situation where that breeds a lot of disinformation, breeds a lot of rumor. And then you couple with that what Grant was talking about, the fact that a low trust in government authorities, the role of the state in the health authorities and so forth, they all kind of fit together to create this environment where it is incumbent on information to flow. good quality elections thrive on transparency. And we have a couple of countries on the continent. We have instances, Burundi. I mean, just before the elections, World Health Organization officials were booted out of the country. We have Tanzania saying that they've got no COVID cases in the country, and yet there are reports that 15 out of 30 of the regions have no cases, implying sort of that 15 have. And that raises all kinds of questions amongst ordinary citizens, like what exactly should they agree? What do they believe or what don't they? On the one hand, we were initially told we don't have to wear masks. And now we do have to wear masks. And so there are lots of questions in ordinary people's minds. And I'm talking mainly about folks who are in the urban centers who kind of know a little bit more, they've got access to a bit more information. But then you link that with low trust environments, low information environments, and that just sort of increases the fragility. There is a lot of pressure for economies to open up, for things to kind of go back to normal, not normal as we knew it, but with new provisions in place, and the extent to which people kind of take COVID-19 seriously enough, especially in many African countries where they are faced with so many other pressures. For some folks, COVID needs to get to the back of the line because there are other more pressing needs around putting food on the table, keeping your job, issues like that, which just it creates an environment where if you know that you can trust what's coming out of your health authority, because they've consistently been good and they can show what's actually happening, I mean, that builds a measure of confidence. I mean, I've been incredibly impressed with the work that the Africa CDC has been doing in terms of providing information, providing updates, supporting member states. But it's incumbent on those member state governments to actually be flowing that information and trust levels down, especially during this time period. We talk a lot about, we've not been talking a lot about voter education and the need for more education. And to just pause there on a moment, I mean, we see it's a no contact environment at the moment. I mean, you can't be going out having mass gatherings for voter education. There's no campaign rallies happening and so forth. We have seen in places like Mali, they've set up a centralized communication center with about 100 journalists who volunteer to work in there and help with the process. They've had youth volunteers help explain to folks just how to actually wash your hands. I mean, that is a new process for some folks. And yet, by the same token, I think it's really early to say low voter turnout. That's what we might see in a lot of Western countries, like France, state elections like Wisconsin and so forth. But Mali has traditionally had a low voter turnout, and that has kind of remained more or less consistent. Guinea's voter turnout has dropped, but it has remained in sort of a 10-point radius. Burundi has had a high voter turnout, and we've seen a high voter turnout in the most recent elections, much, I think, to everybody's surprise. And you've had Benin, where the opposition doesn't participate in elections for a variety of different reasons and typically has a low voter turnout. So we've had 4 major elections, and it's hard to kind of say definitively it's impacting on voter turnout in the same way that it's impacting in places like France and so on. South Korea, high voter turnout under coronavirus. So I think while we need to learn a lot more about the coronavirus as well, we also needed to understand much more about the dynamics that it's having and how it's playing out in different countries. I think those countries that are holding elections towards the end of the year, they have the benefit of learning from those that had it earlier in the year. Those elections that will definitely be impacted in 2021, whether it's Niger second round early in the year or others, they will have the benefit of learning from what other election management bodies have been doing, and hopefully one should start seeing a general improvement in terms of how election management bodies are approaching not just issues of voter education and citizen awareness, because now it's not just about how to conduct the vote, but how to stay safe and healthy during that time period as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I'm thinking about now, we're talking about this issue of public trust and voter education efforts. You mentioned efforts, and they're very important, and they, in most countries, involve some contact with those who go out into the field that do the voter education. Again, another point of contact. I think sometimes we've been thinking a lot about E-Day and Election Day, the contact there, but there's that important piece, and a lot of money and a lot of support is spent on and is used in that pre-election phase in terms of voter education. And I'm curious, Funto, what are some of the guidelines and approaches that you see as being useful to ensuring that voter education occurs in the midst of, as Rushdie explained, a situation where there's a lot of different information that is out there, some of which that is not being fully disseminated, and some of it that is being dissembled, perhaps in some cases. So what is a good approach in this COVID-19 era in terms of reaching out to voters, educating them on their political options, as well as the process that they're going to have to partake in with all the health considerations that are present?
Thanks, Peter. I think that's a valid point, that voter education now is not just about mobilizing the voters and explaining the voting process, but it now has an additional layer. And the first thing is for electoral commissions to work very closely with health authorities. As Rushdie said, the Africa CDC is doing a lot of work, and they have different guidelines that have been published. Electoral commissions need to take advantage of those guidelines and to ensure that whatever information they are putting out is in line with that. There's a lot of misinformation going around. So electoral commissions have that first job of countering wrong perceptions and wrong information that is out there. Now, that's the first. The second point I'd like to make is about, in terms of the mode of voter registration. Like you're saying, we no longer can do roadshows and get out into the communities and talk to the people. Lots of electoral commissions are now turning to community radios, which provide very valuable coverage, at least in the African context. It's not everyone that has access to TV or has electricity to watch TV, so community radios become the go-to space. The use of varied languages as well, and also developing voter education messages in a way that every single person can be reached. Use of social media so that the young people can be reached, using the traditional methods. Also developing materials for persons with disability. If we expect them to be involved in the electoral process, they also need to know what is on. Then, in terms of the content of the message, it's important to explain to people from very credible sources. What is this virus? How is it transmitted? What is the Electoral Commission doing to ensure that if I come out to vote or I come out to register, I will remain safe? And questions around steps taken to keep people safe. And what do I do if I'm sick? Like yesterday, you referred to the webinar that was hosted yesterday, where Professor Yakubu was on. But one question he couldn't answer was, so what happens when you have a sick voter? I think 2 weeks ago, the African Union also hosted one, and there was only one or two commissions that said, fine, even if your temperature is high, we have separate queues for you, but take note, the health authorities will be on hand to take you for a test once you've voted. We cannot deprive you the right to vote, even if you're COVID positive. But lots of commissions said, no, we don't understand what steps we're supposed to take when people turn up and they have symptoms, or it's even proven somebody can say this person tested positive. So you see, that means a lot of commissions have not yet taken the step to help the community to overcome the stigma. Which means if my neighbor tests positive and I dare see him going out to register, I tell the rest of the community to sit where they are because the COVID positive guy has gone into the registration center. So that's one additional step electoral commissions now need to make. Because if in regular situations, like I was using the example of South Africa, sick people in hospital and all that have the right to vote. And there's special arrangements for them. So what makes COVID a different situation? So these are some of the areas that some extra work, additional work needs to be done. And to have effective voter education as well, you need to work with civil society. I don't think electoral commissions can do it all by themselves, but the most important thing is to agree on the messaging and use the civil society as the foot soldiers. Also, there's need to work with other government agencies. Elections don't happen in a vacuum. So there has to be good engagement with other government agencies. Security agencies, especially in this situation where the security agencies are now deployed to enforce the different guidelines. They as well need to come up with messaging. What will be their role in the elections? And how will this work? Because as well, you don't want a situation where because there's a policeman in the station to enforce that people comply with social distancing, then once I see a policeman, I turn and run away because so these are some of the issues to deal with when you think about voter education.
And I think that point you raise about what you do if there is a sick voter or a potentially sick voter is really important. And one of the things people are raising now is if somebody is pregnant, for example, or for a variety of reasons, their temperature may be elevated. They may be flagged by any sort of temperature screening that is present. So what are you going to do in those cases? And will that deter voters from trying to vote in some way, particularly if it's not communicated well? Another thing, I just want to summarize one of the things that I think struck me, Olafunto and Rushdie as well, your comments, which is that perhaps there's an opportunity in this context of COVID-19 to have voter education be of course about voter education, but also about health education as well in the context of COVID-19. And the two can kind of can be married at some level together. So I think that was a really important observation. One of the things, as we move on, one of the comments that we had here, sorry, let me put that comment up. It comes from Zoom, from Memory Medicani. She was talking about how election campaigns have been compromised in many ways. And she's coming from Zimbabwe. And she says, as it's known that the state media in general has been used for state propaganda, it's not very open in terms of the ability for opposition to campaign and use radio and use TV. And my question to you, Grant, on this issue of the media space, and I think the media is kind of an interesting piece in this whole COVID-19 era, because it's something that in some ways can be accessed by everyone, no matter where they are. So if you have a radio, you're able to access it. It's not like some of these other processes we've been talking about. But at the same time, in this COVID-19 area, one of the areas that some leaders have sort of gone after is the media, which may remain one of the key instruments of campaigning, as Memory has alluded to in her comment. So I'm curious, Grant, from your perspective, what is the movement towards ensuring, what are the steps that one can take to ensure that media environment at least provides some space, perhaps for opposition candidates to campaign in by-elections or general elections in countries like, and Memories coming from us from Zimbabwe, from countries like Zimbabwe. I'm curious your thoughts.
Look, the media has been crucial, not just in election time, but they've been crucial covering what has happened during the pandemic. I think that this court the globe, quite frankly, by surprise. And because many countries have instituted some kind of partial or even total shelter in place or lockdown strategy to keep people in their locations, in their dwelling places, and not to move around, the media has become even more important as a conduit to channel that information that Rushdie was talking about to people in their homes, to give them updates. And on the health side, a lot of the governments that have recognized the importance of feeding this information to their citizenry to try and build cooperation, to try and build that level of social compact, have used the media or have made the information available through the media. That has been a crucial conduit. So the media, its importance during this pandemic has been immense. At the same time, the media itself, certainly private media all over the world, have faced massive headwinds as a result of declining advertising revenues because of the lockdown impacting economic activity, the inability to sell hard copy sheet newspapers if that's the media that they typically distribute, and just generally the media has faced huge challenges in financing its ongoing operations, even as its importance has increased. Now, coming to the aspect of the media and elections, this is again, it's exemplified by the problem that we have of state media, where state media typically in countries like Zimbabwe tend to reflect favorable views for the incumbent ruling party, certainly the incumbent candidates, and typically tend to either or tend to cover opposition parties in an unflattering light. Mm-hmm. That kind of media is not doing the kind of service that we're looking for in promoting stronger and healthier elections. At the same time, under normal circumstances, I would suggest that all is well, because the rise of social media and the rise of independent media has been sort of a countervailing force to that. But unfortunately, during the lockdown, with these shelter-in-place type of regulations and stipulations, that hasn't been as possible. And so the importance of the media really has escalated during this time, as much as the challenges for independent media have grown, and the influence of state media. So I think that this, for me, is a very real concern, and I really like the comment from memory. I think that was a very, very important observation.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming back to you, Grant, you mentioned a broader set of stakeholders, and Olafunto also mentioned civil society organizations as well. So I want to bring them in this conversation a little bit. And as we see in this COVID-19 era, we've moved to a new form of activism. Maybe we can call it virtual activism, or the activism of webinars and live conversations, right? And it's a unique form, and it's an important form, and perhaps it has some benefits, right? Because it brings together a lot of different stakeholders from across the globe who can interact in these platforms. But obviously, at the same time, it's not a very grassroots form of activism because of all the access challenges that are present and one's busy schedule to connect at a given time of a virtual meeting. And so I'm curious, Grant, against this backdrop, how is civil society navigating the activism and the engagement and the advocacy that they usually do before elections, in advance of elections, in this COVID-19 era? Are they trying to engage voters and citizens more broadly? Are they able to use these platforms to interact with election officials and election management bodies? What does it look like in terms of that civil society engagement in this period?
Well, I think as I intimated earlier, there's been huge challenges in that space. Typically, the ability to move around and to be active and to be visible on the ground has been certainly one of the hallmarks of grassroots organizations, certainly local civil society organizations, and also international organizations, the ability to move between countries. All three of the organizations that we're representing on this panel, we move from election to election. We cross national borders to go and support the work of local organizations and local actors in strengthening their democratic processes. And we're all grounded at the moment because so many national borders are closed to travel. International flights are not available at the moment. There's some indication that they're starting to open up under severe restrictions. And so significant challenges to all of that, which is, I think, why I flagged it earlier. Civil society organizations, they tend to live very much hand to mouth for a large part of the electoral cycle, but during the pre-election period, typically when more attention is focused on an election, that's usually a good opportunity for local actors to really get in on the electoral act and to get into the electoral process and perhaps strengthen their financial positions. I'm talking practically here, just from a financial perspective, because there's so much attention during the elections themselves. And a number of countries that we're looking at now may end up missing that boat, with very real long-term implications for the financial viability of organizations that used to rely on some kind of electoral support or role in the electoral process to kind of buttress their finances. And of course, we've also got to recognize the importance, just as was flagged earlier, of training the electoral staff. And it's not just civil society who are doing voter education, the EMB that is doing voter education to citizens. It's its own staff. Now, no country has ever trained its staff on how to deal with these COVID-19 challenges. And there again, typically voter education is a very underfunded activity by the EMB, and civil society organizations very often bridge the gap there. They make up the difference and try and cover some of the areas where the electoral staff are not being properly trained. Mm-hmm. And again, the inability of people to meet in the same place, to meet and gather in gatherings is very, very crippling to some of those organizations and their activities.
Absolutely. Rushdie, coming to you on this point, do you have anything else to add? And Olafunto, I'll get to you on this the civil society component. And I know, just for our audience, we got about 20 minutes left in our conversation. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share those with us, because we have only 20 minutes left. But Rushdie, on that point of civil society activism and inclusivity of their views and their activities, what are you seeing on your end? Or
I'll speak specifically on the issue of election observation. I mean, one of the big issues that comes around the confidence that ordinary voters have in elections often stems from comments made by either domestic or international observers. These have been complicated in recent times in places like Kenya and so forth when it comes to the timing with which statements are coming out. That's a whole different conversation. I think that observer organizations like the African Union, the regional economic communities like SADC, ECOWAS, and so forth, Grant mentioned it, everybody's staying at home at the moment, and the internationals aren't able to travel. So much pressure shifts onto the domestic observer groups, and it pushes them to, one, improve on their observation methodology so that they now actually have elements which talk about COVID-19. I mean, if it wasn't for the observer groups in places like Mali, we wouldn't know about hand-washing kits and those things arriving late to stations and effectively not being used. We've seen strong election domestic observer groups such as the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission play a very prominent role in also pointing out the failures to adhere to COVID-19 mitigation measures in the recent by-elections. And they've actually proposed to the Zimbabwe Election Commission that they postpone upcoming future municipal elections. And the commission has listened to them and has agreed that that postponement needs to happen. So in my mind, domestic observer groups are the ones who are critically pushed to the forefront to kind of act as those primary custodians around the observing the quality, the process, what actually is happening. And I think that there is a need to build those kinds of relationships across borders as well, so that entities are learning from each other and understanding what are the different precarities which actually exist. That's a critical part of advocacy. Elections, while it's a sovereign practice, the broader focus on democracy building is a much bigger initiative. And this is also where international communities need to play a role in terms of strengthening their domestic partners in being able to rise to the challenge. There are lots of criticisms that will be laying at the feet of observer groups, especially the domestic ones. They're biased, they partisan in some form or other. But it is incumbent on these groups to rise up to this new challenge and potentially, I mean, over the next decade, I mean, with kind of, we all believe very fervently that we will come out of the pandemic stronger. But I would like to see domestic groups, especially observer groups themselves, civil society organizations rise up as well and become stronger out of this process. They can't do so without resources. They can't do so without technical support, and they can't do so without cooperation with the authorities, because at the end of the day, CSOs are not the ones mandated to run elections. They serve as critical custodians of the process. And so there needs to be this broad cooperation, which actually you alluded to earlier also about parties, ruling and opposition parties coming together, because the pandemic doesn't stick to party lines. Mm-hmm. We have seen the chairperson of the Guinea Election Commission pass away because of COVID. There are rumors of a recent passing of a president on the country, possibly linked to COVID. We have no idea how COVID is impacting from that kind of perspective. And for that reason, we do need to see a need for more coming together, sharing of lessons, sharing of experiences in order to strengthen CSOs, but also the broader practitioners associated with elections and democracy per se.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, and I'm glad you brought up the international actors in international election observation. And for many, election observation, let's just start there, is a really key part to building that confidence or trust in the electoral process to some degree, although some will debate the effectiveness of election observation. We don't have to do that here today. But some would suggest that they're very important actors in that process. And as you've mentioned, Rushdie, with travel restrictions in place, it's very hard for international observer groups to function, because they oftentimes, and for those of you in the audience who don't know, election observation missions draw from a variety of different countries, neighboring countries to the country holding the election, as well as broader international members of their mission. So with those constraints in place, Olafunto, what does monitoring or observing look like from a third-party perspective in the context of elections? Is it going to be possible? I know some organizations have been talking about observing elections that have been delayed in Ethiopia at some point when those elections happen. So there's talk, we see oftentimes these bulletins saying we're recruiting election observers on standby. So I'm curious what you think it's going to look like. Is there a way to have election observers present, international monitors present, or is it going to be some sort of modified version of election observation that we've become accustomed to?
Thanks, Peter. I think the first thing to say is we all will have to modify everything. So even election management is now modified. So I want to believe that international observation as well does not escape that space. But I think Rushdie made a very important point that right now there is a lot more attention and more focus on citizen observers because they are the ones in the country. But that, I don't think that takes away the value and the importance of international observers. However, with travel restrictions, groups like the AU, the EU, are differently impacted because they need to fly into a country. In the case of Burundi, you would remember the EAC was ready to get into the country because they could drive in and the land borders in Burundi were not closed. And then the next question was, oh, well, you have to observe the 14-day quarantine. And that then brings a bigger question to the issue of international observation. However, even before we get into the question of you getting into the country, a lot of international observer missions right now have not been able to deploy their pre-election assessment missions. So this already starts to impact on the quality of observation that you would find. Deployment of long-term observers as well becomes a big question, because who wants to go into a country and not be very, very well assured of the safety measures in place? And electoral commissions have very clearly come up to say we cannot guarantee the safety of observers. So the question is, are we going to be seeing long-term observers, or everybody will just be there for the 10, 15 days and be out of the country? Yes, I agree with you. A lot of modifications have to go to the question of international observation. But from what I see right now, regional bodies seem to have an advantage over groups like the AU or the EU or the NDIs and the rest. And I think then that there has to be some leveraging on that particular advantage. If you can get international observers to go from neighboring countries. I know that one chair of an electoral commission had said internal observers on arrival have to show proof that they were tested for COVID before leaving the country, and the country as well would then take steps to test within the 14 days of their arrival. So again, you see, these are then modifications to how international observers experience their work into different countries. So yes, I think it's going to be modified international observation. I think the most recent mission that was deployed was by the OAS in Suriname, and it wasn't a long-term observer mission. As well, it wasn't a very large observer mission like you would have the OAS or the AU or employ. So I don't know if this means we are now going into, a phase of having limited international observation and more focus now moving to citizen observers, or it's just a matter of prioritizing more the regional observers over the continental and the other non-African groups. But yes, it leaves a big question mark on international observation.
And I agree. I'm glad you raised that issue of the security of the observers. And we've all on this panel served as election observers in a number of elections. And one of the things these observer missions always care about is the security of their observers. When they come in at the end of the day, when they check in, and then we add this health consideration there, and not many guarantees that it will be very easy to leave the country if need be, or things of this nature. It calls into, it raises a number of different issues that have to be navigated. Just building on what Olafunto said, and I think we're sort of discussing the shift from, say, the EU observer missions or the Carter Center or the NDIs, as you mentioned, Olafunto, to more regional and sub-regional observation and support, alongside a movement to rely more on domestic civil society to carry out some of the observation, some of the support in the terms of the election process. And to you, Grant, and I know ISA has worked very closely, as well as International IDEA, with regional bodies, such as the African Union, for the continent of Africa, obviously, and then we have the East African Community in East Africa, SADC, the Southern African Development Community in Southern Africa, and then we have in West Africa the Economic Community of West African States. There's also ICAS in Central Africa. And so I'm curious to know a little bit more, Grant, about what those engagements look like. What does that support look like at the regional level, both from your perspective as ISA, giving that support, but also what you're seeing in terms of the strategies that regional bodies such as the AU, SADC, ECOWAS are using to play a constructive role in monitoring, observing, and also supporting election commissions in some of the implementation of some of the strategies that are necessary.
Yeah, I think that Olafunto hit the nail on the head. It's certainly easier for regional bodies to support the advancement of democracy and democratic processes because of the proximity that they have to the country that's holding an election. So exactly the example of Burundi was a very, very good one. The signs are fairly mixed at the moment. I can just zero in on the Southern African Development Community for a moment. The current president of SADC is President John Magufuli of Tanzania, and at the outset of the real outbreak of the pandemic, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa engaged or wrote to Magufuli as the chairperson of SADC to try and organize some kind of SADC-wide coordinated response to how SADC countries were going to deal with this matter. And he didn't receive a response. Now, there's been some diplomatic backpedaling and massaging of the exact details of what happened. But what was clear was that two members of the same regional economic community had differing views on how to approach the coronavirus and what the response should be. Cyril Ramaphosa apparently then went ahead and arranged a meeting of neighboring South African states, which includes some SADC members, but obviously not all, and didn't try and couch it as some sort of SADC-wide event because that's not appropriate. But it does highlight that, within these regional bodies themselves, there are all of the same kind of complicated relationships and thrusts and different directions which these regional bodies are looking for. The member states within these bodies are looking for. So, just assuming that these bodies can pick up the slack and can just seamlessly step into a role that has been vacated by other bodies misunderstands perhaps some of those internal dynamics. Mm-hmm. Another important point to note on whether or not these regional bodies can actually cover for these the African Union, the EU, the Carter Center. Every single one of these missions adopts a different mandate. They come to the country and evaluate the elections in different ways. And even between the RECs, so the way in which SADC would evaluate an election and the way in which ECOWAS evaluates an election is determined by their internal principles and guidelines. And both of those bodies have different, they're complementary, but they have different emphases in their principles and guidelines for election observation. And so we can't just assume that there will even be uniform approaches to the election observation. Ultimately, though, the point that Olafunta made stands because any observation, any support given to the democratic processes in the country by its neighbors, by the international community, is obviously something that we really do want to see more of at this stage. And we don't want to see the coronavirus completely bring that to a halt for the moment.
Olafunta, is there anything you'd like to build on in Grant's sort of a discussion? And I love, Grant, how you talked about the differences between these regional bodies, because oftentimes they're looped all together, right? The AU, and then we have these sub-regional bodies, but they're doing very different things. They have very different approaches to how they observe, how they interpret, and the type of support that they give to election management bodies. And so I'm really glad that you raised that importance of that nuance there. Olafunta, to you, anything else you'd like to add about the constructive role that regional bodies may play, as well as some of the support that International IDEA has had with some of these regional bodies in enhancing their capabilities and perhaps amplifying their voices on a number of these critical concerns around elections?
I think what I'll add is just very brief to say that beyond observing elections, these bodies also are involved in high-level diplomacy, and this has also been impacted by the pandemic because they can't go into the country to do this physically. However, good that we have technology. So some countries are still able to engage with leaders of other countries. So in countries like Malawi, where there is a very subtle crisis going on, I think there's been some form of high-level mediation, but of course it's limited because these people can't go in be in person to engage with different stakeholders. Also to mention that the AU is developing guidelines for electoral commissions that are having elections in the context of the health emergency, the health crisis. And the intention is that electoral commissions can use this material going forward, not just about the COVID pandemic, but other forms of health crisis. So I just thought to mention those two other aspects of the work of the AU and the REX beyond election observation. But of course, one last point, the level of technical assistance that can be provided to electoral commissions at this point as well is limited. But I think everyone is now sitting and rethinking how to move most of the support they can provide online. So trainings and just developing research materials and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I've seen that International IDEA as well as support staff for the AU have been arranging opportunities for election management bodies to come together to have discussions on some of these critical issues. So it seems like that's certainly taking place. As we close, I want to ask you a question, Rushdie, about something that we haven't talked about yet. Well, we've mentioned it, but we haven't talked specifically about it. And that's the other political stakeholders. We've been talking about civil society, citizens, election management bodies, but then obviously we have the opposition parties and those who are competing in the elections. And you've mentioned the issues of the campaign process. And we've also mentioned, I believe, Olafunto, you mentioned earlier, the acceptance of results and that issue particularly in the post-election phase, which has been a problematic in a number of contexts, both in the COVID-19 era, so thinking about countries like Guinea, but obviously outside of the COVID-19 period. And I'm curious, Rushdie, what is campaigning going to look like in this COVID-19 era? And is it going to be sufficient for the opposition to feel like they've been able to mobilize the kind of support that they want to? And so that's my first part of my question. The second one is, when the opposition does want to mobilize, do you believe that in many of the contexts that you're looking at, and many of the countries that are having upcoming elections, whether they're going to be given some amount of space to campaign or to engage voters, or do you anticipate governments and those who are in political power using sort of the COVID-19 concerns to perhaps limit reasonable, I'll put it this way, reasonable ways of mobilizing voters and engaging with them?
Thanks, Peter. There's a few things that kind of come in there. I think that we are seeing on the African continent much more adversarial elections than before. The level of polarization between ruling and opposition parties has definitely ramped up. And a lot of this, I mean, in part, there's many dimensions. On the one hand, there's the dimension around campaign finance. How much money you have sometimes dictates what you are able to do. And as we talk about the ability of opposition or even the ruling parties being able to take things online, it also depends on the level of sophistication which exists within those parties. And we've seen now on a number of occasions the sort of very high stakes elections in places like Kenya and elsewhere, even Nigeria. You've had groups come in, these public relations companies and so forth coming in and being able to bring a pretty sophisticated approach. Well, let me put it, they bring a sophisticated approach to the campaigning, the messaging which they put out in terms of the spin or the propaganda and so forth. It's very much old school approaches, but yet it's very sophisticated. Audiences are segmented, audiences are geolocated, and targeted messages for different groups are run through focus groups and all of these kinds of things. So campaigning has already taken a more sophisticated dimension in some countries than others. But during COVID-19, I think there's definitely going to be a much bigger push to both a combination of social media and mainstream media, whether it's radio, television, and so forth. Then you get into this question about who's got access, and who's got access to those media, and who does the media belong to. And we've already sort of mentioned the state media versus private media, and what ability exists to be able to buy media space. And there are some places where we talk about the restrictive environment generally with regards to democracy. And in those kinds of instances, I think talk of having a free media who's able to be used to distributing messages, I think we're seeing significant challenges there. Journalists are actually being killed, murdered. And so there's an element of self-censorship that comes in. So campaigning, I think, will definitely advantage the incumbent and the ruling party who've potentially got access to the state media already, and potentially could be using it to be putting out or not putting out communications with regards to COVID-19. But opposition parties definitely will need to be much more creative in the approaches that they're taking. But so much of that also depends on the level of sophistication that they have with regards to their internal structures, their ability to organize, as well as access to funding that would actually allow them to either bind their expertise or develop their expertise, or be able to mobilize locally even, with no kind of face-to-face contact. And I easily see that until there's a vaccine or clarity as to how we're going to be controlling the rising surge in some parts of the world, including Africa, with regards to COVID, we're all going to have to become much more creative. We're all going to have to modify, as Funto says, and that includes the parties as well. And I think opposition parties have got a steeper hill to climb than the ruling parties for sure.
Yeah, that's an important point. We're all in that process of modification. Yeah, go ahead, Rusty. You want?
I wanted to also maybe add something in about the regional organizations.
Sure.
And Grant's mentioned the complexity attached to it. There's a complexity attached to what kind of support is also given. But by the same token, I mean, there is an important role for regional organizations to be playing. And this links in kind of with the issue about the opposition as well. I mean, we are seeing also the rise of not just the continental bodies associated with the executive, but you're also seeing a rise in terms of the courts. So more and more we're seeing the African Court for Human and People's Rights stepping forward and pronouncing on issues associated with elections. They've recently done so on Benin, recommending that the elections not proceed because the opposition was excluded. The issues of sovereignty and the extent to which member states actually allow or abide by these kinds of decisions are very critical, and it speaks a lot to the extent to which regional integration will grow on the continent. While we might be sharing PPE in the form of masks and so forth, we are needing to kind of on the political level also look at what's happening in that space and the extent to which accountability also happens at that kind of a level. And that kind of brings me into this issue about the opposition parties, the polarization, and the fact that courts locally, to kind of speak about a different stakeholder, are becoming far more prominent in the issue of electoral justice, electoral dispute resolution. We see the second annulment of the elections in Malawi. We saw Kenya already. More and more opposition parties are able to actually take these things to court, and that's a good thing. Where it's tough is, of course, when they raise the bar for election management bodies in terms of following their own procedures. But at the end of the day, it is incumbent on election management bodies to carry out what is decided in Parliament, what is decided in case law, what's in line with the Constitution. We've just seen the Constitutional Court declare some parts of the Electoral Act unconstitutional and encouraging independents to run in national and provincial elections. I mean, that decision was just taken today it's going to mean an overhaul, but it means it's a start over. As I spoke to a colleague of mine there, it's a start over, and the courts are playing such a prolific role at the moment when it comes to adjudicating and setting a higher bar, which I think is correct in terms of our expectations when it comes to the quality of elections and our expectations of the promise of democracy broadly. And I think absolutely election management bodies need to rise up to it, but so do all of us as the international community, as the media, as domestic civil society organizations, as ordinary citizens. There is a need right now, and one sees it as a groundswell across the globe for social change and a high expectation as to what we actually want to get out of democracy. And I'm hopeful for the next decade, but we do need to get out of the pandemic first.
Yeah, and I love that point about bringing in the courts in here and mentioning both Kenya and Malawi, these decisions that are really important, because even if we look out at post-election court decisions around the world, we don't see many courts that have been willing to really mitigate or challenge aspects of the process or make them at least be reconsidered. So I'm glad you mentioned that as another stakeholder that may be very important in this COVID-19 era, when we don't have perhaps international observation being as prominent from outside the continent and even on the continent as well. So I think that's a powerful point. We're at the last word time. I think, Rushdie, you kind of gave us a good last word there. Olafunto, over to you. Your sort of last word moving forward. What are your sort of prospects for moving forward in terms of adopting some of the solutions and frameworks and minding some of the concerns that we've discussed today in our conversation? So over to you, Olafunto.
Certainly, but I wonder what else I want to say when Rushdie has said the next decade, let's just get out of the pandemic first. But that's quite important. But I think the current situation we found ourselves actually puts every electoral stakeholder in a space where they need to begin to have a completely different kind of conversation. Electoral commissions now need to look beyond just the thing of we run an election to tick the box. It's another 4 or 5 years. Oh, did we have sort of election? Was it done? It's fine. Voters are becoming more demanding. Political parties are becoming more demanding. And it's time to think more about the quality of our elections rather than just the thing of we have regular elections, we check the box and there's somebody else in office, whether it's the same person that has been there for so long or puts the next puppet there and we move on. Then I think this particular pandemic as well opens the door for conversations around alternative forms of voting in Africa, special voting arrangements. Are we going to stick with the traditional voting arrangements going forward? Campaigning, what do we expect to see? Are electoral commissions now prepared to start monitoring online campaign? Questions around cost of elections, the way budgets for elections are being drawn and planned as well, totally. These are questions that electoral commissions now need to begin to think about. And I mean, there's also just a lot of questions around equal access for all voters and even citizens themselves now beginning to think about how has this impacted my ability, my capacity to participate in the public affairs of my country. So these are conversations, deeper conversations that the pandemic is now moving us into. And I hope in the coming years, these are questions that people will be willing to answer just beyond the question of was country A or country B able to have an election and whether we are fine with it.
Thank you, Olafunto. So it sounds like there are a lot of opportunities at this point to really deal with some concerns that have been concerns for a long time, and perhaps use it as an opportunity to improve in areas that we haven't even thought about improving, at least in the short run. So I think that's a really powerful point. Thank you, Olafunto. And lastly, to you, Grant, you have our last word today, I guess. You know, what do you see as the prospects moving forward and the adoption of these some of these solutions, given again all of the challenges we've mentioned and discussed?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Firstly, I'm getting a lot of messages from people who are watching this from all over Africa. So let me just compliment you on running a great show here, and clearly you're doing your piece to get the information out there. So thanks very much for the invite. But I don't like to end on a negative note, but I think we've focused on the opportunities quite a lot. We've focused on how we can move matters forward. The reality is that this pandemic is a once in a generation kind of event, and it's placing huge strain on not just the electoral process, but on the livelihoods of people. It's going to continue to place those strains on the economy, on the livelihoods of people going forward. And at a time when citizens see massive prioritization around the narrow containment of the spread of this virus, there's understandably growing anger, and that anger typically manifests itself at points of political contestation. Now, the reality here is that we are looking at a very challenging and potentially conflict period going forward, certainly in some countries. And I think as far as possible, the unity that is possible between the actors that we've talked about today, the stakeholders that we've talked about today, is going to be critical in managing some kind of consensus building, some kind of developing a social compact that helps societies navigate the tensions and the stresses of this time without flying apart. Some societies will manage that better, some societies will manage that worse. This is Africa, it's not one country, there are many countries on the continent, but I think that the reality is that as much as we're focusing on opportunities, on positives here, we need to recognize that this is a very, very serious challenge, and that there are a lot more stresses that need to feed their way through the system before we're out of the woods.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, it's a crisis that is very multidimensional in nature, and as was mentioned, I think this is an important point that as much as we're talking about COVID-19 and elections, the confronting of COVID-19 also has to take place, and it's necessary for that to take place as well, and the effects that it touches on everyone's lives. So at this point, I want to thank our panelists today for joining us. We're joining from all these different locations, and although we had some technical difficulties at the very, very beginning, everything went smoothly, and it's great to have each of you here. Again, just to remind you, we have Mr. Rushdie Nakaradian from IFES, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, joining from Washington. We also have Ms. Olafunto Akindero, who is at International IDEA and joining us from South Africa. And then we have Mr. Grant Masterson, who's also joining us from South Africa. So a very big thanks to you all, and the audience seemed to be very enthusiastic about so many of your comments and the things that we've discussed. So thank you so much to each of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you for having us.
Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you for joining us today on Leaders of Africa Live. We are certainly in good hands when it comes to the dedicated and insightful election practitioners who support quality election processes across the continent of Africa. We will, of course, continue to follow all the developments on the ground, including the rerun of elections in Malawi, postponed elections in Ethiopia, and other countries with elections scheduled for later this year, such as Ghana. Let us continue the conversation and stay tuned for our next live conversation coming soon. To hear first, subscribe to our newsletter at leadersofafrica.org and our new YouTube channel, like our Facebook and LinkedIn page, and join our Telegram app group. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. My name is Professor Peter Pinar. It has been great to be with you. We look forward to seeing you again. Until next time, we'll see you soon. Hi, Grant. Can you hear me?